The emergency alarm echoed through the massive council chamber on Station Nexus 7. Ambassador Velthar's 4 eyes widened as the distress signal appeared on the central display. His silver skin turned pale blue, a sign of fear among the Seraphim people. Colony Viridian 4 is under attack, the station's computer announced in a calm voice. 50,000 civilians in danger. The Kreth swarm has been detected approaching the planet. The council chamber filled with worried voices. Representatives from 23 different alien species looked at each other with concern. Everyone knew about the Kreth swarm. They were like a plague of giant insects that ate everything alive in their path. Once they started, they never stopped until nothing was left. Velthar stood up from his floating chair. His long robes flowed around him as he moved to the center of the room. "We must act quickly," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "The swarm will reach the colony in 72 hours. We need to send military forces immediately." The representative from the Vryn species raised one of her 6 arms. Her name was Sylveth, and she was known for being very careful about her people's well-being. "Ambassador Velthar, we cannot simply send our soldiers into combat. What about their mental health? What about the trauma they might experience?" Murmurs of agreement filled the chamber. The Othari representative, a being made of living crystal named Thun, nodded slowly. "The Vryn representative speaks wisely. Our warriors need proper psychological preparation. We cannot expose them to such violence without extensive therapy sessions first." Velthar felt his heart sinking. He had feared this response. All the advanced species in the Galactic Council had rules about warfare. Strict rules. Rules that protected soldiers from mental harm. On the surface, these rules seemed kind and progressive, but right now, they were becoming a death sentence for 50,000 innocent people. How long would preparation take? Velthar asked, though he already knew the answer. The Meridian representative, a floating being of pure energy, spoke in a melodic voice. "Our protocols require a minimum of 2 weeks for pre-combat psychological evaluation, then another week for mental preparation exercises. Our soldiers also have the right to refuse deployment if they feel emotionally unprepared. We don't have 2 weeks." Velthar's voice rose in desperation. "We have 3 days." Silence fell over the chamber. The truth was clear to everyone. Their advanced civilization, with all its progress and enlightenment, could not save those people in time. Their own rules prevented them from acting quickly enough. One by one, the species representatives explained why they could not help. The Seraphim's elite guard was still recovering from a minor conflict 2 years ago. Half of them were in therapy. The other half had not completed their emotional wellness training. The Vryn Military Council would need to vote on deployment, and that took at least 10 days. The Othari warriors were physically ready, but their mental health officers had not cleared them for combat duty. In the back of the chamber, Ambassador Jihun sat quietly. He represented humanity, the newest member of the Galactic Council. Humans had only joined 5 years ago, and many species still considered them primitive. Jihun was a small man with dark hair and tired eyes. He wore a simple uniform, not the elaborate robes most ambassadors preferred. He had been listening carefully to everything. As each species refused to help, he felt a cold anger growing in his chest. These aliens talked about psychological wellness and emotional protection, while 50,000 people were about to die horrible deaths. Velthar looked around the chamber with despair in his eyes. "Is there no one? Will no one answer this call for help?" Jihun stood up. His movement was quiet, but somehow everyone noticed. The chamber fell silent as all eyes turned to the human ambassador. "Humanity will deploy immediately," Jihun said. His voice was calm and firm. Gasps filled the room. Sylveth's expression showed shock and disgust. "Ambassador Jihun, surely you cannot be serious." "Your soldiers need psychological preparation. They need therapy. They need orders," Jihun interrupted. "And I will give them those orders. Captain Minho and his battalion will depart within the hour. They will arrive at Viridian 4 in 68 hours. Thun's crystalline form flickered with what might have been concern. "But Ambassador, your people's mental health, the trauma of combat, the emotional scars, how can you send them into such danger without proper psychological support?" Jihun's expression did not change. "My people understand what needs to be done. They will do it." Whispers spread through the chamber. Jihun could hear some of the words. Heartless. Primitive. Barbaric. They still think like ancient warriors. They haven't evolved past violence. The Centauran representative, a tall being with multiple heads, spoke up. Ambassador Ji-hoon, we appreciate your offer, but we must express concern. Your species' casual approach to combat trauma is disturbing. Sending soldiers into battle without proper emotional preparation it's cruel. It's inhumane. What's inhumane, Ji-hoon replied quietly, is letting 50,000 people die while we debate psychological protocols. Velthar moved closer to Ji-hoon. Despite his concern about human methods, he was grateful someone was willing to act. Ambassador, we will need to send observers with your forces to coordinate the evacuation and, he hesitated, to ensure proper procedures are followed. Ji-hoon nodded. Of course, Captain Minho will welcome your observers aboard the TCS Indomitable. He turned to leave the chamber, then paused and looked back at the assembled representatives. My people have a saying. When everyone else is talking, someone has to be doing. We'll do what needs to be done. As Ji-hoon walked out, the chamber erupted in discussion. Some representatives were relieved someone was taking action. Others were horrified that humans were being allowed to proceed without proper psychological oversight. Sylveth immediately began drafting a proposal for mandatory mental health intervention for all human military forces after the mission. Velthar selected himself and 2 others to serve as observers. Kesara, a Vryn psychologist, and Thun, the Othari combat analyst. They would document everything the humans did. If the humans succeeded, it would be studied. If they failed or if they showed signs of psychological damage, it would be used as evidence that humanity needed help. Far away from the council chamber, on Earth, Captain Minho received his orders. He was a quiet man in his mid-30s with a face that had seen too much already. He read the mission brief twice, then called his battalion together. 500 Marines assembled in the hangar bay. They were men and women from the Korean Expeditionary Force, one of Earth's elite units assigned to galactic service. They stood at attention in neat rows, their armor polished, their weapons ready. Minho looked at them. These were good people, brave people, people who understood that sometimes you have to stand between the monsters and the innocent, no matter the cost. We have a mission, he said simply. 50,000 civilians need evacuation. Hostile force approaching. Expected casualties are high. He paused. I need volunteers. Every single hand went up. Not one person hesitated. Minho felt something tight in his chest, but his face remained calm. Good, he said. We leave in 1 hour. Check your gear. Say your prayers if you have them, and remember what we fight for. The Marines saluted and dispersed to prepare. Not one complained. Not one asked for psychological evaluation. Not one requested time to emotionally prepare. They simply did what soldiers had always done. They prepared to stand between the innocent and harm, whatever the cost to themselves. The TCS Indomitable, humanity's fastest assault carrier, began powering up its engines. Soon it would jump to faster than light speed, racing toward a distant colony and a battle that would change how the galaxy viewed humanity forever. In the council chamber, as the representatives continued their debate about human psychology, none of them understood a simple truth. The humans weren't heartless. They simply had hearts strong enough to break for people they'd never met, and that made all the difference. The TCS Indomitable cut through space at faster than light speed. Inside the massive ship, 500 human Marines went about their preparations with calm efficiency. Captain Minho stood in the briefing room, a holographic display showing the layout of Viridian 4 colony floating before him. Lieutenant Hyejin entered the room and saluted. She was a young woman with sharp eyes and a confident stride. Sir, the battalion is ready. All equipment checks complete. We'll be ready to drop the moment we arrive. Minho nodded. Good, what about our guests? Hyejin's expression shifted slightly. The alien observers are observing, sir. They seem very interested in everything we do, especially the fact that we're not having therapy sessions. In another part of the ship, Velthar, Kesara, and Thun walked through the Marine quarters. What they saw disturbed them deeply. Marines sat cleaning their weapons while joking with each other. Some were playing card games. Others were exercising in the gym. A few were sleeping peacefully. None of them looked worried. None were in therapy sessions. None seemed to be preparing emotionally for the trauma of combat. Kesara, the Vryn psychologist, felt her concern growing with each passing moment. Her species had spent centuries developing protocols to protect warriors from mental harm. Seeing the humans ignore all of those protocols felt wrong. It felt cruel. "This is deeply troubling," she said to Velthar. "These soldiers are about to face a terrifying enemy, yet they receive no psychological support, no counseling, no emotional preparation exercises." Velthar's silver skin had turned a worried shade of purple. "Perhaps humans process trauma differently than we do?" "No species is that different," Kesara insisted. "The mind has limits. These humans are either suppressing their emotions dangerously, or they have been conditioned not to feel fear. Both possibilities are concerning." Thune's crystalline form flickered thoughtfully. Unlike his companions, the combat analyst was less worried about psychology and more interested in how the humans actually fought. "I wish to understand their tactical doctrine," he said. "Their efficiency is remarkable. I have never seen soldiers prepare with such casualness." They approached a group of Marines. Kesara decided to conduct impromptu interviews. She needed to understand these humans' mental state. Private Daesung was a young man, barely 20 years old. He was checking his rifle when Kesara approached. "Excuse me," she said gently. "May I ask you some questions?" Daesung looked up and smiled. "Sure, ma'am. What do you need?" "How do you feel about the upcoming battle?" Kesara asked. "Are you afraid?" Daesung considered the question. "Yeah, I'm scared." Anyone who says they're not scared before a fight is either lying or stupid. Kesara felt a small relief. At least they could feel fear. Then how can you function? How can you prepare to fight when you're experiencing fear? The young Marine seemed confused by the question. Because being scared doesn't mean you can't do your job. It just means you're smart enough to understand the danger. Before Kesara could respond, Corporal Bora joined the conversation. She was a small woman with a pilot's insignia on her uniform. "Ma'am, I think you're confusing feeling emotions with being controlled by emotions. We feel fear. We feel sadness. We feel all the things you probably feel. We just don't let those feelings stop us from doing what needs to be done." "But the trauma," Kesara protested. "The psychological damage from combat. How do you cope?" Bora and Daesung exchanged glances. Sergeant Tajin, an older Marine with scars on his face, walked over. He had overheard the conversation. "Ma'am," Tajin said respectfully, "we cope by remembering why we fight. Those 50,000 people on that colony, they're somebody's family, somebody's friends. They didn't ask to be attacked by monsters. Someone has to stand between them and those monsters. That someone is us. But what about your mental health?" Kesara's voice was almost pleading now. "What about theirs?" Tajin replied simply. "Those civilians who are about to die if we don't help them. What about their mental health? What about the trauma of being eaten alive by the Kreth swarm?" Kesara had no answer to that. The logic was simple, even harsh, but she could not argue against it. Thune, who had been listening carefully, asked a different question. "Sergeant, what happens if you die in this battle?" Tajin smiled sadly. "Then I die. But those people live. That's the job." The three observers left the Marine quarters in silence. Kesara immediately began writing a report to send back to the council. Her hands shook as she typed. These humans were displaying clear signs of martyrdom complex, emotional suppression, and dangerous disregard for their own psychological well-being. They needed help. They needed intervention, but as she wrote, doubt crept into her mind. The humans seemed happy, not in a manic way, not in a way that suggested they were hiding pain. They genuinely seemed at peace with their choice to fight. On the bridge, Captain Minho reviewed the latest intelligence on the Kreth swarm. The news was bad. The swarm had accelerated its approach. They would reach the colony not in 72 hours, but in 48. Velthar stood beside him, watching the captain's face for signs of panic or distress. There were none. Minho simply adjusted the mission timeline and began recalculating their approach vector. "Captain," Velthar said carefully, "the timeline has shortened significantly. Your soldiers will have almost no rest before entering combat. Perhaps we should request additional forces." "There are no additional forces," Minho replied. "Every other species is still preparing psychologically. We're it. Does that not concern you?" Minho turned to look at the alien ambassador. "Ambassador, I'm always concerned. But concern doesn't change the mission. Those people need help. We're the only ones who answered. So we do the job, but how?" Velthar's frustration was clear. How can you send your people into this? 100, maybe 200 of them will die. How can you live with that? Minho's expression hardened. I live with it because the alternative is 50,000 dead civilians. I don't ask my people to die, Ambassador. I ask them to fight. There's a difference. I don't understand. I know you don't. Minho turned back to his display. Your people and all the others in the council, you've forgotten something important. You've made your soldiers so safe, so protected, that they can't actually protect anyone. You call us primitive. You call us heartless. But when people are dying, you'll notice something. We're the only ones who show up. The words stung because they were true. Velthar had no response. Lieutenant Heejin's voice came over the intercom. Sir, we're approaching the drop zone. All Marines ready for deployment. Minho activated the ship-wide communication system. All hands, this is Captain Minho. We're going in early. The swarm has accelerated. That means we have less time, but the mission stays the same. Protect those civilians. Get them on the evacuation transports. Hold the line until the job is done. He paused, then added, some of us won't make it home. That's the reality. But 50,000 people will live because we were here. Because we answered the call. Make every shot count. Watch each other's backs. And remember, we're not fighting for glory or honor. We're fighting because someone has to. In the troop bay, 500 Marines checked their weapons one last time. There were no stirring speeches from officers. No dramatic ceremonies. Just soldiers preparing to do a job that needed doing. Velthar, Kisara, and Thune strapped themselves into observer seats in the command dropship. Through the viewport, they could see Viridian 4 growing larger. They could also see dark clouds moving across the planet's surface. The Kreth swarm had already made landfall. We're too late, Kisara whispered. No, Heijin said from the pilot's seat. We're exactly on time. Those people are still alive, which means we still have work to do. The dropships launched from the Indomitable like a swarm of metal birds. As they descended through the atmosphere, the observers got their first clear view of what they were flying into. The colony was a mess of buildings and barriers, surrounded by automated defense turrets that were firing continuously. But the defenses were being overwhelmed. Dark waves of Kreth insects, each one as large as a big dog, were flooding over the walls like water. Prepare for combat landing, Heijin announced calmly. Kisara wanted to close her eyes but forced herself to watch. These humans were about to throw themselves into a nightmare, and they were doing it without hesitation. The dropships hit the ground hard, the ramps dropped, and 500 human Marines charged into hell to save people they had never met. Velthar watched them go and finally understood why the other species called humans heartless. It was easier to believe humans felt nothing than to accept the truth. The truth was that humans felt everything, deeply and painfully. They simply loved strangers enough to face that pain anyway. That kind of courage was terrifying to species who had forgotten what sacrifice meant. The sounds of battle filled the air before the dropships even touched ground. Weapons fire, screaming civilians, and the horrible chittering of millions of Kreth insects created a symphony of chaos. Lieutenant Heijin's dropship landed hard in the colony's central plaza, crushing several Kreth under its weight. The ramp dropped. Marines poured out in perfect formation. Within seconds, they had established a defensive perimeter. Their rifles barked in controlled bursts, cutting down Kreth that rushed toward them. The aliens looked like enormous beetles with serrated mandibles and armor-like shells. Their eyes were empty of intelligence, driven only by hunger. Captain Minho was the last off the command dropship. He immediately began issuing orders. Heijin, take Alpha Company east. Secure the evacuation route to Landing Zone 2. Taijin, heavy weapons, I need you on the southern wall. Those Kreth are breaking through. Yes, sir. The responses came quick and clear. Velthar, Kisara, and Thune stumbled off their dropship into madness. They had never seen combat like this. In the modern galactic military, warfare was mostly conducted at long range with drones and automated systems. Soldiers rarely saw their enemies up close. This was different. This was personal and brutal. A Kreth leaped toward Kisara. She screamed. A burst of gunfire cut the creature down inches from her face. Private Daesung stood beside her, his rifle smoking. Stay close to me, ma'am, he said calmly. It's going to get worse before it gets better. Worse seemed impossible, but Daesung was right. As the Marines pushed deeper into the colony, the scale of the invasion became clear. The Kreth had broken through the automated defenses on 3 sides. Thousands of the creatures were already inside the colony walls. Civilians ran in panic through the streets trying to reach the evacuation zones. Hyejin's company reached the eastern sector and immediately ran into trouble. A large group of Seraphim families were trapped in a residential building surrounded by Kreth. The insects were tearing through the building's walls. "First platoon with me," Hyejin shouted. "We're getting those people out." Her Marines charged forward. The Kreth turned to face this new threat. What followed was close-quarters combat of the most brutal kind. When the Marines' ammunition ran low, they used their rifles as clubs. When those broke, they used knives. When those were lost, they used their hands. Corporal Bora fought beside Hyejin, shooting Kreth that got too close to the building entrance. "We need to clear a path," she yelled over the noise. "Working on it." Hyejin fired her sidearm into a cluster of Kreth, then turned to the trapped civilians. "When I give the signal, run. Don't stop, don't look back, just run to the evacuation zone." A Seraphim mother clutched her 2 children, both crying in terror. "We can't. There are too many of them. That's why we're here." Hyejin shot another Kreth. "Trust us. We'll get you out." It took 15 minutes of continuous fighting, but Hyejin's platoon managed to carve a corridor through the Kreth. The Seraphim families ran, protected on both sides by Marines who formed a human wall between them and the monsters. On the southern wall, Sergeant Taijin set up his heavy weapons team. They had brought the biggest guns humanity had. Massive automated cannons that could fire hundreds of rounds per minute. But even those seemed inadequate. The Kreth kept coming in endless waves. "How many of these things are there?" shouted Private Jinwoo, feeding ammunition into one of the cannons. "Too many," Taijin replied. "Just keep firing." Thune had followed Taijin's unit, wanting to observe human combat tactics. What he saw amazed him. The Marines worked together like parts of a single organism. They anticipated each other's movements. They covered each other's blind spots. When one Marine's weapon jammed, another was already moving to cover their position. But it was more than just tactical efficiency. It was the way they fought, with determination, with purpose, even with joy at being able to protect others. These weren't people being forced into combat. These were people who had chosen this, who wanted this. A massive Kreth larger than the others charged toward the wall. Taijin's cannons tore into it, but it kept coming. At the last moment, Taijin grabbed a rocket launcher and fired at point-blank range. The explosion killed the creature, but also knocked Taijin backward. He slammed into the wall hard. Thune rushed to him. "You're injured." Taijin coughed, blood on his lips. His ribs were definitely broken. "I'm fine. You need medical evacuation. I need to keep fighting." Taijin struggled to his feet, ignoring the pain. "Those transports aren't full yet. People still need protection, but you're hurt." Taijin looked at the crystalline alien with something like pity. "So what? I can still pull a trigger." He returned to his position and continued directing his team's fire. Thune stood there stunned. By every standard of galactic military medicine, Taijin should be in a hospital. Instead, he was fighting through pain that would have disabled most species. In the command center, Captain Minho coordinated the defense. Holographic displays showed the battle from every angle. It was not going well. The Kreth were adapting, finding weak points in the defensive line. More importantly, the evacuation was taking longer than expected. 50,000 civilians could not be moved quickly. Velthar watched Minho work. The human captain had been grazed by Kreth claws during the initial landing. Blood seeped through a tear in his uniform, but Minho paid it no attention. He simply continued giving orders, moving units like chess pieces on a board. "Captain, you're wounded," Velthar said. "I know. You should receive treatment later, but—" "Ambassador." Minho turned to face him. "See that display? That's showing civilian evacuation progress. We're at 42%. That means 29,000 people are still in danger. I'll get treatment when they're safe." Not before an urgent call came through. "Sir, this is Daesung. My squad is cut off. We're trapped in Building 7 Alpha with 12 Seraphim children. The Kreth have surrounded us." Minho's jaw tightened. "Can you hold?" "We'll hold as long as we need to, sir." The connection cut out. Minho immediately began planning a rescue operation, but all his forces were engaged. There was no one to send. Private Daesung and his 5-person squad had been escorting a group of school children when the Kreth cut off their retreat. Now they were trapped in a single large room on the 3rd floor of a residential building. The children huddled in the center while the Marines guarded the windows and doors. The Kreth were everywhere, crawling up the walls, trying to break through. Daesung's team fired continuously, dropping creatures as they appeared. But ammunition was running low. "How many magazines do you have left?" Taesung asked his team. "2," said one Marine. "1," said another. "3, but one's only half full." Taesung checked his own ammunition. 2 magazines left. Maybe 300 rounds total for 5 Marines. And thousands of Kreth outside. One of the Seraphim children started crying. She was very young, barely old enough to walk. Taesung knelt beside her for a moment. "Hey, it's okay. We're not going to let anything hurt you. Promise?" she asked in a tiny voice. "Promise." Taesung smiled at her, then returned to the window and resumed firing. 6 hours passed. The squad's ammunition dwindled to nothing. They used furniture to barricade the doors. When the Kreth broke through one barricade, the Marines fought them hand-to-hand in the doorway using knives and improvised weapons. Kesara received updates on Taesung's situation. She was horrified. "Why don't they abandon the children and save themselves? They could jump from a window, escape through the Kreth lines. The children are slowing them down." A nearby Marine, wounded and waiting for transport, heard her. "Ma'am, with respect, we don't abandon people, ever. Those kids are depending on us. We'd die before we let them down. But that's exactly what's going to happen. You're all going to die." The Marine shrugged. "Maybe. But those kids will have had 6 more hours of life because we were there. And maybe we'll hold long enough for rescue to arrive. Either way, we do our duty." Kesara wanted to argue but couldn't. The logic was alien to her. Her species would never ask soldiers to sacrifice themselves like this. It was considered cruel, inhumane. But looking at the Marine's face, she saw no resentment. No feeling of being forced, just calm acceptance of what needed to be done. Corporal Bora made a different choice. She volunteered for a suicide mission. An atmospheric fighter damaged during landing could still fly. Barely. The pilots had abandoned it as unsalvageable. But Bora was a good pilot. She could fly anything. She climbed into the cockpit and powered up the dying machine. The fighter had 1 missile left, just 1. But intelligence showed a massive Kreth hive cluster on the colony's edge. If that cluster reached the evacuation zone, thousands of civilians would die. Minho tried to stop her. "Corporal, that fighter will never make it back." "I know, sir. You'll die. I know that too, sir. Why?" Bora smiled. "Because someone has to. And I'm already here." She closed the cockpit canopy. Belthar watched the fighter take off, trailing smoke. It wobbled through the air, barely maintaining altitude. Bora flew it straight toward the hive cluster. At the last moment, she fired her missile and dove the fighter directly into the heart of the cluster. The explosion lit up the darkening sky. The hive cluster collapsed, killing thousands of Kreth and buying crucial time for the evacuation. Belthar felt something he had never felt before. Not quite grief. The last transport lifted off from Viridian 4 just as the sun rose on the second day. Lieutenant Hyejin watched it climb through the smoke-filled sky, carrying the final group of civilians to safety. All 50,000 evacuated, every single one. "All units, this is Captain Minho." The radio crackled. "Mission complete. Begin fighting withdrawal to extraction point." The Marines who were still alive started pulling back. They moved in organized groups, covering each other as they retreated. The Kreth followed, but slower now. The hive cluster's destruction had disrupted their coordination. Hyejin's squad reached Building 7 Alpha, where Taesung's team had been trapped. They found the door barricaded with furniture and bodies. Kreth bodies. Dozens of them. "Taesung, are you in there?" Hyejin called, a weak voice answered. "Here, Lieutenant." They pulled away the barricade. Inside, they found 2 Marines barely standing and 12 Seraphim children huddled together but alive. Taesung was covered in blood, his knife still in his hand. Private Minzu was unconscious but breathing. The other 3 members of the squad were dead, their bodies near the windows where they had fought to the end. "We held, ma'am," Taesung said, then collapsed. Hyejin got them all to the extraction point. The TCS Indomitable waited in orbit. Dropships carried the survivors up in waves. Out of 500 Marines who had landed, 373 were returning. 127 were dead, 203 were wounded, some critically, but 50,000 civilians were safe. The journey back to Nexus 7 station took 3 days. The Indomitable's medical bay worked around the clock. Human doctors moved between beds treating injuries that ranged from Kreth bites to broken bones to severe blood loss. Kesara volunteered to help. She expected to find Marines angry or traumatized or breaking down from their experiences. Instead, she found something else. She found Sergeant Tajan in a bed, his chest wrapped in bandages from his broken ribs. He was teaching a young Seraphim boy, one of the rescued children, how to play a card game. The boy was laughing. "Sergeant," Kesara approached carefully. "How are you feeling?" "Sore," Tajan admitted. "But I'll heal." "What about emotionally? The things you saw? The things you did?" Tajan looked at the Seraphim child. "Ma'am, I held a wall for 30 hours. I saw 3 of my friends die. I thought I might die too. Yeah, it was hard, it hurt. But look at him." He gestured to the boy. "He's alive because we were there. That makes it worth it. But the trauma will be there," Tajan finished. "I'm not saying it doesn't affect us. I'll probably have nightmares. I'll probably think about the ones we couldn't save. But that's the price we pay. Someone has to pay it." Kesara moved through the medical bay talking to more Marines. Each conversation challenged her understanding. These humans were not emotionless. They felt everything deeply: fear, grief, pain. But they had made peace with those feelings. Corporal Minji, who had lost half her squad, explained it best. "Ma'am, you're thinking about it wrong. You think we don't care about trauma. We do. But we care more about the people who need help. We process our pain by knowing it meant something. We honor our dead by continuing their mission. But wouldn't it be better not to experience that pain at all?" Minji looked at her with sad eyes. "If we didn't feel pain, we wouldn't be human. The pain reminds us that what we do matters, that the lives we save are real, that the sacrifices mean something." On the 3rd day, the Indomitable docked at Nexus 7. The Galactic Council had called an emergency session. Every species representative was present. The chamber was packed. Ambassador Velthar stood at the center. He had changed during the mission. His silver skin was darker now, marked by exposure to combat. His voice was different too, harder. "The rescue of Viridian 4 was successful," he announced. 50,000 civilians evacuated safely. 0 civilian casualties. Relief flooded the chamber. Representatives congratulated each other as if they had contributed. Then Velthar continued. "Military casualties: 127 human Marines killed in action. 203 wounded. All casualties from the human forces. No other species participated." Silence fell. The congratulations stopped. Sylveth of the Vryn stood up. "While we are grateful for the rescue, we must address a serious concern. The human approach to combat is deeply troubling. Their disregard for psychological welfare, their willingness to sacrifice their soldiers, their complete lack of proper emotional protocols. This cannot be normalized." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. "I propose," Sylveth continued, "that humanity be required to undergo species-wide psychological evaluation and treatment before they are granted full council membership. Their behavior, while temporarily useful, represents a dangerous mindset that could influence other species." "Seconded," said the Centauran representative. More voices joined in support. The humans were broken. They needed help. They needed to be fixed before they could be trusted. Kesara stood up. This surprised everyone because she had been one of the loudest critics of human methods before the mission. "I must speak," she said. "I was there. I watched them fight. I treated their wounded. And I must tell you, we are wrong about them." Confused whispers filled the chamber. "The humans are not psychologically damaged," Kesara continued. "They are emotionally mature in ways we have forgotten. They do feel fear and pain and grief. They simply refuse to let those feelings prevent them from helping others. That is the very definition of emotional suppression," Sylveth argued. "No," Kesara said firmly. "Emotional suppression is denying your feelings. The humans acknowledge their feelings and then choose to act anyway. That's not weakness. That's strength." Thune rose to speak. "I observed their combat tactics. Their efficiency was remarkable not because they are heartless, but because they care deeply. Every action was motivated by protecting others. They fought harder when defending civilians than when defending themselves." Velthar added his voice. "I have seen things I will never forget. I watched a young private hold a position for 6 hours to protect children he had never met. I watched a pilot fly a suicide mission to save thousands. I watched a captain lead from the front while wounded, refusing treatment until his mission was complete." He paused. "We called them Heartless, but the truth is they have the biggest hearts in this chamber, big enough to break for strangers. big enough to sacrifice for people they will never know. Sylveth was not convinced. Regardless of your observations, we cannot allow this mentality to spread. I call for a vote. Should humanity be required to undergo psychological intervention? Seconded. Multiple voices called out. Ambassador Ji-hoon, who had been sitting quietly, finally stood. His face was tired, but his eyes were hard. Go ahead, he said. Vote to fix us. Vote to make us more like you. More careful, more safe. More concerned with our own emotional wellness than with the lives of others. He walked toward the center of the chamber. But understand what you're really voting for. You're voting to make sure that next time there's a crisis, next time people are dying, there will be no one willing to help. Because we're the only ones who answer. We're the only ones who show up. That's not fair, Sylveth protested. It's completely fair, Ji-hoon replied. 50,000 people were dying. We asked for help. No one came except us. That's not an opinion. That's a fact. Before the vote could be called, alarms sounded throughout the station. Every representative's personal device lit up with emergency notifications, a new distress call. This time much worse. A convoy of refugee ships, 3 million civilians fleeing a war zone, was stranded in disputed space. Raiders were moving to intercept them. The refugees would be slaughtered in hours. The chamber erupted in chaos. Representatives immediately began discussing the situation. How long would psychological preparation take? Which species could mobilize fastest? What were the proper protocols? Ji-hoon listened for exactly 30 seconds. Then he stood and walked toward the exit. Ambassador Ji-hoon, Velthar called out. Where are you going? Ji-hoon stopped at the door and turned back. To save 3 million people. What are you going to do? The silence that followed was deafening. Every representative in the chamber knew the answer. They would debate. They would discuss. They would follow their protocols and procedures and psychological wellness guidelines. And while they talked, Ji-hoon would act. He left the chamber. Behind him, Velthar looked at the assembled representatives. He saw their comfortable robes, their safe seats, their well-protected emotions. Then he made a decision. I'm going with him, Velthar announced. He removed his ambassador's robe and walked toward the door. Kesara and Thune exchanged glances. Then they followed. At the Indomitable's docking bay, Captain Minho was already assembling his Marines. They had barely finished treatment. Some still wore bandages. Others walked with limps. But when the call came for volunteers, every single Marine who could stand had reported for duty. Minho saw Velthar, Kesara, and Thune approaching. Observers again? He asked. No, Velthar said. He picked up a rifle from the equipment rack. Participants, we wish to fight beside you, to learn what you know, to remember what we forgot. Minho studied the 3 aliens. They were scared. It showed clearly in their body language. But they were here anyway. He nodded. Welcome to the team. The Indomitable departed Nexus 7, racing toward another crisis. The TCS Indomitable cut through space toward the refugee convoy. Inside, the ship was quieter than before. The Marines who had survived Viridian 4 were tired, healing, carrying fresh wounds both visible and invisible. But when Captain Minho called for volunteers, not one had refused. Lieutenant Hyejin stood in the troop bay watching her Marines check their equipment. Her company had lost 37 people at Viridian 4. Now the survivors were preparing to risk their lives again, barely 3 days later. Velthar approached her. He was wearing combat armor now, human-made and slightly too large for his frame. He looked uncomfortable but determined. Lieutenant, he said, may I ask you something? Of course, Ambassador. How do you do it? How do you keep going after what happened? Hyejin paused in checking her rifle. We remember why they died. My people didn't die for nothing. They died protecting 50,000 lives. That means something. So we honor them by continuing the mission. But the pain is real, is heavy, is always there. Hyejin's eyes were distant for a moment. I think about them every day. Private Sunho, who loved bad jokes. Corporal Youngmi, who was planning to get married next month. Sergeant Donghyun, who had 3 kids. I remember all of them. The pain of losing them is part of me now. Then how can you fight again? Hyejin met his eyes. Because more people need help. Because the mission isn't finished. Because if I let my pain stop me, then their deaths really would be meaningless. Velthar was beginning to understand. The humans didn't ignore their trauma. They transformed it into purpose. Elsewhere on the ship, Kesara sat with Corporal Minji in the medical bay. Minji was cleared for duty despite losing half her squad days before. The psychologist in Kesara couldn't comprehend it. "Minji," she said gently, "you lost people you cared about. By every standard I know you should be in therapy for months. How are you ready to fight again?" Minji was quiet for a long moment. "Ma'am, I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not okay. I probably won't be okay for a long time. I wake up seeing their faces. I hear them calling for help. It hurts. Then why? Because 3 million people are going to die if we don't help them. And my friends died saving people. If I stop now, if I let my pain make me useless, then I'm spitting on their sacrifice. I honor them by continuing what they started." Kesara felt something shift in her understanding. "You're not suppressing your emotions. You're channeling them." "Yes, ma'am. The pain fuels us. The grief reminds us why we fight. We don't run from it. We carry it with us and let it make us stronger." Thune spent time on the bridge with Captain Minho, studying human tactical doctrine. The combat analyst was fascinated by how humans approached warfare differently than any species he had studied. "Captain," Thune said, "I notice your soldiers do not have the option to refuse deployment. In my species, any warrior can decline a mission if they feel emotionally unprepared." "That's true," Minho acknowledged. "Our soldiers volunteer for service, but once they're in, they go where they're needed." "Is that not coercive?" "No, because they chose this path knowing what it meant. Every Marine knows that service means sacrifice. They accept that before they ever put on the uniform." "But what about their individual well-being?" Minho turned to look at the crystalline being. "Thune, I care deeply about every Marine under my command. I want them all to go home. But I also know that sometimes individual well-being has to take second place to collective survival. If we let every soldier refuse deployment because they felt scared or unprepared, we'd never have enough people to protect those who need protecting. So you sacrifice the few for the many. We serve the many. It's not the same thing. Sacrifice implies unwillingness. My Marines are willing. They understand that their comfort, their safety, even their lives, matter less than protecting the innocent." Thune processed this. "Your species has not forgotten the warrior's code. You remember that to be a protector means accepting risk. We remember that freedom isn't free, safety isn't guaranteed. Peace requires guardians, and guardians pay a price." The Indomitable arrived at the refugee convoy's coordinates after 2 days of hard travel. The situation was worse than anticipated. The convoy consisted of hundreds of civilian ships, mostly old and barely functional. They were dead in space, their engines damaged, and surrounding them were 30 raider vessels moving in for the kill. Minho assessed the situation quickly. "We're outnumbered and outgunned. The raiders have military-grade ships. We have 1 carrier and dropships. What do we do?" Velthar asked. "We do the job anyway." Minho turned to his crew. "I need volunteers for a boarding action. We're going to take those raider ships from the inside. It's dangerous. High probability of casualties." Every hand went up, including Velthar's, Kesara's, and Thune's. Minho allowed himself a small smile. "Good. Let's go save 3 million people." The plan was bold to the point of insanity. Small teams of Marines would use stealth dropships to approach the raider vessels. They would board through airlocks or cut through hulls. Once inside, they would fight their way to the bridge and take control. Hyejin led 1 boarding team. Velthar insisted on joining her squad. As their dropship approached a raider cruiser, Velthar felt fear like he had never known. His species had not engaged in shipboarding actions in centuries. The risk was considered too high. But looking at Hyejin and her Marines, he saw no hesitation. "Just focus, remember," Hyejin said to her team. "We're not here to kill raiders. We're here to stop them from killing refugees. Disable their ships, capture if possible, but if they force combat, end it quickly." The dropship latched onto the raider hull. Marines used cutting torches to breach. The moment the hole was large enough, they poured through. The fighting inside the raider ship was brutal and close. The raiders were professionals, well-armed and experienced. But they weren't ready for the ferocity of human Marines protecting civilians. Velthar found himself in the middle of a firefight. His hands shook as he fired his rifle. He missed more shots than he hit. But Hyejin was always there, covering him, guiding him. "Breathe," she said calmly while shooting 2 raiders. "Fear is normal. You can be afraid and still fight. Let the fear sharpen your focus." They fought their way to the bridge. Heejin breached the door with explosives. Inside, the raider captain reached for a control panel, probably to self-destruct or send a signal. Velthar shot him. His hands were still shaking, but the shot was true. The raider captain fell. Heejin secured the bridge. Good shot, Ambassador. Velthar looked at his hands in shock. He had just killed someone. His species considered that one of the worst traumas possible. He should be breaking down. Instead, he felt purposeful, clear. Across the battlefield, similar scenes played out. Marine teams boarded raider ships and fought with determination. Kessara, despite having no combat training, found herself dragging a wounded Marine to safety while under fire. Her fear was overwhelming, but she did it anyway. Thune discovered something profound. When faced with actual combat, his species' psychological protocols seemed meaningless. In the moment, there was no time for emotional processing. There was only action and reaction. Do or die, save or fail, and in that clarity he understood. Humans didn't skip psychological preparation. They prepared by accepting that fear was inevitable and choosing to act anyway. The battle lasted 6 hours. Of 30 raider vessels, 15 were captured, 12 destroyed, and 3 escaped. The refugee convoy was saved. All 3 million civilians safe. The cost: 89 human Marines killed. Over 300 wounded. Velthar had taken a raider bullet to his shoulder. Kessara's arm was broken. Thune's crystalline form was cracked in several places, but they had done it. They had stood between innocent people and harm. And for the first time in their lives, the 3 aliens understood what that meant. The journey back to Nexus 7 was different from the first time. The observers were no longer observers. They were participants. They had bled beside humans. They had fought beside humans. They had saved lives beside humans. Velthar sat in the medical bay, his shoulder bandaged. Heijin sat beside him, her own wounds being treated. I understand now, Velthar said quietly. This is what we lost. This willingness to pay the price. We became so concerned with protecting ourselves from pain that we became unable to protect others from harm. Your species evolved past warfare, Heijin said. That's not a bad thing. But we evolved past sacrifice too, past duty. Past the understanding that sometimes your comfort matters less than someone else's survival. That's not evolution. That's amnesia. The TCS Indomitable arrived at Nexus 7 to find the station in chaos. News of the rescue had spread. 3 million refugees had been saved by a battered human ship and crew that should have been recovering from their previous mission. The Galactic Council assembled immediately. This time the chamber was different. Representatives stood as Velthar, Kessara, and Thune entered. They were wounded, wearing bandages and armor instead of robes. Velthar approached the center of the chamber. His voice was strong despite his injuries. I have seen humanity at war. I have fought beside them. I have bled with them. And I must tell you we were wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Sylveth started to object, but Velthar continued. We called them heartless because they do not flinch from sacrifice. We called them primitive because they remember how to fight.